It was a brisk, sunny afternoon in Ottawa when the press conference began. Members of the Canadian Parliament gathered in the ornate, old press room, their faces serious, as journalists shuffled in and set up their equipment. The excitement was palpable. Everyone knew today's briefing would be one to remember. Prime Minister Fiona Calloway had just finished her statement on Canada's new environmental policy when the next speaker took the stage. Her face was set in a confident, resolute expression. It was Minister of Foreign Affairs, Leo MacArthur, known for his sharp wit and even sharper tongue. The room quieted, awaiting his remarks. His presence had always commanded attention, but today, there was an additional spark in his eyes, something personal, as though the usual professionalism was laced with a touch of anger. "I know you're all wondering about the United States," MacArthur began, his voice calm but filled with a quiet intensity, and their peculiar leadership. "So let me clear the air." A murmur ran through the room. Journalists exchanged glances, some already reaching for their notebooks. MacArthur, it seemed, was ready to address something bigger than mere policy. MacArthur took a deep breath before continuing, his fingers lightly tapping the podium. "It's no secret that our southern neighbors have been led by a man who, let's say, does not have the same regard for facts, reason, or decency that we hold dear in this country." His eyes flicked toward the sea of reporters, gauging their reactions. Some nodded, others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension in the air. "Donald Trump, the former President of the United States, has spewed enough misinformation to fill 100 lifetimes." MacArthur's voice grew more pointed, the calm now replaced with an unmistakable edge. "And yet, despite his disgraceful antics, many still hang on to his every word, as though he were some kind of authority." A journalist in the back raised a hand. "Minister, are you suggesting that Trump's influence is still a threat?" MacArthur's gaze hardened as he responded. "Threat? No. But his antics are certainly a spectacle. And it's a spectacle we must confront head-on. Canada will not, cannot, and must not allow itself to be dragged down by his rhetoric or the dangerous ripple effects of his actions." He paused for effect, letting the words sink in before continuing. "We, as Canadians, believe in science, in truth, and in the importance of dignity, something Trump has long abandoned. And it's high time that the world sees us as the moral compass we've always been." The room was silent. The tension was almost tangible. MacArthur had just made a bold statement, and it was clear this was no ordinary political discourse, it was a challenge to the very foundation of Trump's brand of politics. A reporter from a major U.S. news outlet raised his hand, his voice laced with skepticism. "Minister MacArthur, don't you think such a direct attack on a former U.S. president could damage relations between our countries? Shouldn't Canada take a more diplomatic approach?" MacArthur's eyes flashed with a mix of resolve and frustration. "Diplomacy," he echoed, his voice slightly raising, "is built on respect, mutual understanding, and accountability. And frankly, when a man like Trump continually undermines those values, when he sows division, spreads lies, and attacks the very fabric of democracy, there comes a point where silence is complicity." He turned slightly to face the cameras, addressing the audience directly. "I believe that we, as a global community, must hold people accountable for their actions. Trump's influence has led to the normalization of toxic behavior, both in the U.S. and beyond. And it's time for leaders everywhere to call it out, as we've done today. Canada has a responsibility to stand firm on the side of truth and decency, even if that means confronting figures like Trump head-on." A quiet buzz ran through the room. The weight of MacArthur's words hung in the air. Another reporter piped up, more cautiously this time. "So you're saying Canada should openly oppose Trump if he decides to re-enter politics?" MacArthur didn't hesitate. "Yes. Absolutely. We will oppose any attempt to bring back the chaos, the lies, and the divisiveness that he embodied. If he runs again, we will not sit idly by while the world watches another disastrous campaign unfold." The reporters were now fully engaged, their pens racing across notepads. But MacArthur wasn't done yet. He had one final point to make. MacArthur took a slow, deliberate step forward, his voice lowering, yet every word carrying a weight that made the room hang on his every syllable. "Let me be clear," he said, his eyes narrowing, "Trump's legacy isn't one of leadership, but of destruction." He used his position not to uplift, but to tear down. He empowered hate, weakened alliances, and disregarded the very principles that democracy is built upon. And no amount of political spin or media circus can change that. The silence in the room deepened, the reporters sensing a shift, a moment that would be remembered. MacArthur had shifted from measured criticism to direct confrontation, and the audience could feel the full force of his words. He riled up a nation with lies, MacArthur continued, turned truth into a weapon, and normalized the unthinkable. But most damaging of all, he left a mark on the soul of democracy itself. And now, after all the chaos he's caused, he's out there, continuing to spread his venomous rhetoric. He paused, locking eyes with the front row of reporters, and then added with a wry, cutting smile, "Trump has no vision for the future, he only has his own ego, and that's a dangerous thing to put at the helm of a country. If he ever tries to regain control, we won't stand idly by. We will fight against it, both in our words and in our actions." Another reporter, sensing the full weight of MacArthur's remarks, raised their hand, but MacArthur was already shaking his head. "You want to know why I'm so direct about this? Because silence in the face of such madness is complicity. And I, for one, will not sit back and let a man like Donald Trump ever have a chance to rewrite history." The room erupted into murmurs, the tension palpable. MacArthur had just shredded Trump, not with petty insults, but with a righteous fury and a clarity that left no doubt as to where Canada stood. This wasn't just a press conference anymore, it was a moment that would echo through the political landscape for years to come. As MacArthur finished his statement, the room sat in stunned silence. His words hung in the air, resonating far beyond the walls of the press conference room. The cameras flashed, capturing every moment, every nuance of his unwavering stance. It was a statement that was bound to stir up debates, both in Canada and internationally. The journalists, still processing the weight of MacArthur's words, scrambled to ask follow-up questions, but the minister wasn't ready to take any more. He calmly raised a hand, signaling the end of the session. "Thank you for your time," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "We've made our position clear. Canada stands for the values of truth, decency, and respect. And we will continue to do so, no matter who tries to stand in our way." With that, he turned and walked off the stage, leaving a room full of journalists buzzing with disbelief and admiration. This wasn't just a political statement, it was a moment of clarity, a stand against the forces of chaos and division that had come to define Trump's tenure. Outside the press room, news outlets around the world began broadcasting the footage. Social media erupted with reactions, some in support of MacArthur's bold stance, others criticizing it as an unnecessary provocation. But no one could deny that MacArthur had made a lasting impact. His words had sparked something. In the days that followed, the Canadian press conference became a talking point across the globe. World leaders commented, political analysts weighed in, and the public found themselves divided. But one thing was certain, MacArthur had shredded Trump's legacy in a way that was impossible to ignore. And as the world waited to see if Trump would indeed try to make a political comeback, MacArthur's message had been heard loud and clear: Canada was ready to stand firm against the return of the divisiveness and chaos that Trump had embodied. The challenge had been issued. And the world would be watching to see how it played out. The days following MacArthur's press conference were a whirlwind. The political world buzzed with reactions, some in support of Canada's bold stance, others arguing that it was an unnecessary escalation. International leaders, diplomats, and political commentators took to their platforms, reflecting on the implications of MacArthur's statements. In the United States, Trump supporters quickly pounced on MacArthur's remarks, accusing the Canadian minister of overstepping his bounds. Conservative media outlets ran headlines condemning MacArthur's disrespect for a former U.S. president, while far-right groups in the U.S. rallied behind Trump, calling for a diplomatic boycott of Canada. The rhetoric grew heated, but it was clear that Trump's influence remained strong among his base. However, in Canada, the reaction was more divided than expected. Some applauded MacArthur for standing up against Trump's divisive rhetoric, seeing him as a champion of truth and democratic values. Finally, a leader who isn't afraid to call out the hypocrisy. One op-ed read, "MacArthur is reminding the world what Canada stands for: integrity, unity, and respect." But there were others who felt MacArthur had gone too far, unnecessarily provoking a diplomatic firestorm. Canada should be focused on its own issues, not picking fights with a former president, said one critic. This was reckless, and it could hurt Canada's standing with our southern neighbors. Despite the criticism, MacArthur remained unwavering. "We will not apologize for standing up for what is right," he said in an interview a few days later. "Our position is clear. The values that guide us, truth, empathy, and respect, are non-negotiable. If that ruffles some feathers, so be it." Behind closed doors, there was also a ripple effect among Canadian lawmakers. Some were uneasy about the long-term consequences of MacArthur's bold remarks. Could this put future trade agreements at risk? Would it sour Canada's relationship with the U.S. in the coming years? But MacArthur wasn't alone in his resolve. Prime Minister Fiona Calloway threw her support behind him, emphasizing that Canada's foreign policy would always prioritize the country's principles over political convenience. "We will not shrink from standing up for the values that define us," she said in a statement. "Minister MacArthur has spoken the truth, and I stand with him." As MacArthur's comments continued to echo in the political sphere, the world turned its gaze to the U.S., wondering if Trump would take the bait and respond. The stakes had been raised. Would the former president engage in a war of words with Canada, or would he choose to focus on his own political comeback? Time would tell, but one thing was certain: the challenge had been issued, and MacArthur had no intention of backing down. It didn't take long for the storm MacArthur had sparked to reach the United States. The world waited with bated breath to see how Trump would respond to the blistering comments from the Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs. Would he ignore it, or would he take the opportunity to lash out, as he had so many times before? The answer came one crisp morning, just a few days after the press conference. Donald Trump took to his social media platform, Truth Social, posting a blistering, all-caps message aimed squarely at MacArthur. "Leo MacArthur is a clown. He thinks he can shred me and get away with it. Canada has no idea what they're dealing with. I'm coming back stronger than ever, and the world will be shocked by the power I still command." The post was accompanied by a slew of exclamation marks, as Trump's followers flooded the platform with their usual fervor. The tone was unmistakable: Trump was not going to let MacArthur's comments slide. On the other side of the border, MacArthur was quick to respond. In a televised interview, he chuckled lightly when asked about Trump's angry outburst. "I see the man is as thin-skinned as ever," MacArthur remarked, a smirk tugging at his lips. "I suppose I struck a nerve. The truth tends to do that to people who have spent years spinning lies. But let's be clear, this is not about personal insults. This is about values, the future of democracy, and the kind of leadership the world needs. If he wants to fight, I'm more than willing to continue this debate." His response only fueled the fire. The media buzzed with excitement, and Trump supporters were quick to rally behind their leader, calling MacArthur a puppet of the Canadian elite and demanding that Canada apologize for their disrespectful remarks. Trump's team, eager to capitalize on the moment, organized rallies to express solidarity with the former president. But it wasn't just the far right who took notice. Around the globe, political analysts and pundits weighed in, noting that this battle between MacArthur and Trump was about more than just personal clashes; it was symbolic of a larger ideological war. In Canada, the public remained divided. Some cheered MacArthur on, seeing him as a defender of truth in an age of misinformation. Others, however, began to question whether this war of words was worth the risk. Would Canada be able to manage its relationship with the US if this rhetoric escalated? Prime Minister Callaway, ever the diplomat, addressed the nation with a carefully worded speech. "Let me be clear," she said, "Canada remains committed to maintaining a respectful, constructive relationship with the United States. We will not be drawn into unnecessary conflicts, but we will also not compromise on our values." Minister MacArthur spoke with conviction, and I stand by him. "We will continue to focus on what's best for Canadians and for our global community." As tension simmered, one thing became increasingly clear: the battle between MacArthur and Trump was far from over. Each side was digging in its heels, and the world would be watching closely to see who would emerge victorious in this ideological showdown. The back and forth between MacArthur and Trump continued to dominate headlines, but the real impact of their exchange was beginning to extend far beyond the borders of Canada and the United States. The ideological divide that had long been apparent between liberal democracies and Trump's populist brand of politics was now on full display, and the entire world was watching. In Europe, leaders who had once been hesitant to publicly criticize Trump found their voices. France's President, Marie Lefebvre, released a statement of support for MacArthur, calling his remarks a necessary stand against the rise of authoritarianism and misinformation. "It is essential that democracies stand together in the face of this global threat," she said. "The world needs strong leadership based on truth and respect, not division and chaos." Similarly, the European Union released a statement emphasizing the importance of unity among democratic nations in confronting the challenges posed by populist leaders like Trump. The European Union stands in solidarity with Canada and Minister MacArthur's call for responsible leadership and the protection of democratic values, read the statement. The global response was mixed, but one thing became clear: MacArthur's bold stance was beginning to shape the narrative in a way that few had anticipated. While Trump's loyalists in the US continued to rally around him, the international community was slowly rallying behind the values that MacArthur had so passionately defended. Back in Canada, the political landscape was shifting. Calls for unity and a focus on domestic issues began to rise from certain corners of the political spectrum, but MacArthur remained steadfast. "We cannot afford to sit back and allow the world to be shaped by the likes of Trump," he continued to assert. "Our values are non-negotiable, and we will continue to be a voice of reason on the world stage." As the rhetoric between the two sides escalated, the Canadian government was forced to balance its principles with the pragmatic needs of diplomacy. While MacArthur's remarks had resonated deeply with many, some Canadian industries and politicians expressed concerns about the long-term impact of this battle on cross-border trade, security, and cooperation. Despite the criticisms, MacArthur remained resolute. "I have no intention of backing down," he declared in a rare public appearance. "I didn't start this fight, Donald Trump did. And now it's up to us to finish it. Canada will continue to stand firm against anyone who tries to undermine the values we hold dear." As the weeks passed, it became apparent that the MacArthur-Trump clash was evolving into something larger than just a political dispute. It was now a global conversation about the future of leadership, democracy, and truth. And, as it always does, the world watched closely to see who would ultimately prevail in this ideological battle. Months passed, and the tension between MacArthur and Trump reached its peak. What had started as a few sharp words in a Canadian press conference had now spiraled into an ideological standoff that had captivated the world. The impact was undeniable: every statement, every tweet, every rally only seemed to intensify the public's obsession with the clash between the two. In the US, Trump's popularity had surged among his supporters. His rhetoric was now sharper, more venomous, and his rallies grew larger. He attacked MacArthur at every turn, calling him everything from a globalist puppet to a dangerous leftist. The former president continued to paint himself as the champion of the American people, promising to restore the country's greatness and destroy anyone who opposed him. Meanwhile, MacArthur had become somewhat of a symbol for those who had grown tired of the chaos that Trump represented. His fiery rhetoric was matched only by his unwavering commitment to Canada's values. He wasn't just defending his country, he was defending democracy itself, taking on an international figure who had once held the power to lead the most influential nation in the world. The next chapter in their saga would come at the United Nations, where both men found themselves on the same stage for the first time since the initial public confrontation. It was a rare opportunity, one that would set the stage for the final, public confrontation between the two. MacArthur had been invited to speak at the UN Assembly, representing Canada's position on global unity, human rights, and the importance of standing up against authoritarian regimes. But just before his speech, it was announced that Trump, invited as part of a private summit with U.S. allies, would be in attendance as well. The moment was electric. The world's eyes were fixed on New York City, as the two men prepared to face off in a diplomatic arena. As MacArthur took the stage, his speech was calm and collected. He spoke passionately about the need for global cooperation, about the importance of truth in leadership, and about Canada's unwavering commitment to the values of democracy and human dignity. The room was filled with nods of agreement, many of them from leaders who had previously been reluctant to criticize Trump. When it was Trump's turn to speak, the atmosphere shifted. His presence was marked by an air of defiance, as though he felt the weight of the world was against him. As he spoke, he attacked MacArthur directly, casting the Canadian minister as a puppet of international elites, a man out of touch with the real world and its true needs. He claimed that MacArthur's views were a threat to American sovereignty, mocking him with every word. Trump's speech, full of self-righteousness and exaggeration, ended with a call to arms for his supporters, vowing to take back the world and promising to fight against globalist agendas like MacArthur's. The room was electric. World leaders exchanged uneasy glances as the two men locked eyes for the first time in months. The tension was palpable. MacArthur stood calmly, letting Trump finish. Then, with a calm but steely tone, MacArthur responded. "I've listened carefully, Mr. Trump. And what I hear is not leadership, it's fear. Fear of losing control, fear of change, and above all, fear of the truth. The world is changing, and it's changing for the better. People no longer want to live in a world where lies dictate reality. They want truth, they want justice, and they want leaders who will actually stand for the values that make the world a better place. And that is not you." The silence in the room was deafening. The world was waiting for Trump's reaction. He stood frozen for a moment, his face red with anger, but he said nothing. His supporters, however, began to chant outside, making their voices heard once again, but in that room, in that moment, it was MacArthur who had the final word. The moment that MacArthur addressed Trump at the United Nations became a turning point not just for the two men, but for the entire global political landscape. MacArthur's words, calm yet piercing, had struck a nerve with Trump, and the world had taken notice. The confrontation was unprecedented in its public intensity, and it would mark the beginning of a new chapter in international relations. In the days following the UN speech, the media worldwide buzzed with coverage. Headlines dominated both Canadian and international news: MacArthur shreds Trump at UN Assembly, historic clash, Canada versus Trump on global stage, and the final stand, MacArthur takes on Trump and wins. For MacArthur, the response was overwhelmingly positive. In Canada, his approval ratings skyrocketed as citizens praised his courage, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to Canada's values. Editorials and social media flooded with praise for the foreign minister's ability to stand firm in the face of such a heated confrontation. A true leader, many said. Finally, a politician who's not afraid to speak truth to power. But the fallout was just as intense on the other side. Trump's supporters, though still fiercely loyal, were shaken by his inability to respond effectively to MacArthur's attack. Many of them felt that Trump, the great orator and master of confrontation, had been outmatched. His follow-up statements were more erratic, and his social media posts increasingly veered into desperate rants. MacArthur is a nobody, a puppet of the establishment. Trump posted. He doesn't know what the people want. The truth will come, and I will be back, stronger than ever. Despite the bravado, the cracks in Trump's image were becoming increasingly evident. International leaders, who had been wary of antagonizing him for years, now saw an opportunity to push back. Trump's influence waned as more world leaders, particularly in Europe, publicly embraced MacArthur's vision for a more cooperative, values-based global order. Back in Canada, MacArthur was offered new opportunities to expand his influence, both domestically and internationally. He was invited to give speeches at global conferences, urging a new era of international cooperation based on shared human rights and democratic values. He was quickly becoming a prominent figure not just in Canada, but on the world stage. His leadership was beginning to be recognized as a counterbalance to the forces of populism that had swept through much of the West. However, the challenges weren't over. The political fallout from the confrontation still loomed. Though MacArthur had gained support from many, others in Canada were beginning to question whether this high-profile battle with Trump had damaged Canada's standing with the U.S. Some political analysts warned that the rift between the two countries, though not irreparable, could have long-term consequences, especially in areas of trade and cross-border relations. Prime Minister Callaway, ever the diplomat, tried to downplay any lasting damage. "Our relationship with the United States remains one of the strongest in the world," she assured the public. "While we have our differences, Canada will continue to work closely with the U.S. to tackle the global challenges of our time." Minister MacArthur's remarks were made with the best interests of Canada and the international community in mind. But MacArthur, undeterred, continued to push forward. He knew that standing up to Trump had been the right thing to do, not just for Canada, but for the entire world. He remained focused on his mission, to lead Canada with conviction, to defend truth, and to be an advocate for global cooperation in a time when such values were more important than ever. As for Trump, his attempt to rebuild his political empire had begun to falter. The backlash to his global image was mounting, and it seemed that MacArthur's words had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of many who had once supported him. The once unstoppable force was now a shadow of his former self. And so, as the world looked on, the ideological battle between MacArthur and Trump seemed to be winding down. MacArthur's final words at the UN had not just been a direct challenge to Trump, they had been a declaration of a new era, one in which leadership was measured by integrity, truth, and respect. In the end, it was a message that would resonate far beyond any political clash. Months after the historic UN confrontation, the ripples of MacArthur's powerful stand continued to be felt across the globe. The ideological battle between him and Trump had set the stage for a broader conversation about leadership, truth, and the future of democracy. MacArthur's vision for a world led by values of cooperation and integrity was gaining traction, while Trump's influence appeared to be on the decline. In Canada, MacArthur was becoming more than just a political figure, he was emerging as a symbol of the new, progressive global order. His popularity surged, and calls for him to run for higher office began to intensify. Many believed that he was the future of Canadian politics, someone who could lead the nation into a new era of cooperation and moral clarity. But MacArthur, ever the pragmatist, remained focused on his work. He had never sought the spotlight for personal gain, his mission had always been about something bigger. "It's not about me," he said in a rare interview, "it's about ensuring Canada remains a beacon of truth, integrity, and compassion in a world that increasingly seems to forget those values." Behind the scenes, MacArthur's actions were having a significant impact. He worked tirelessly with other democratic nations to strengthen alliances and counter the rising tide of populism. Under his leadership, Canada became a key player in international efforts to combat disinformation, uphold human rights, and promote democratic values. His efforts helped to reshape the conversation on the world stage, shifting it away from the divisive rhetoric that had come to define the previous era. Meanwhile, Trump, who had continued to rally his base with the promise of a political comeback, found himself increasingly marginalized. The once dominant figure now seemed unable to capture the same level of attention he had once commanded. His rallies, though still large, lacked the fervor they once had. His political influence was being overtaken by a new wave of leaders who were focused not on division, but on unity. One such leader was Emma Thomas, a rising star in the U.S. Senate who had positioned herself as a moderate alternative to Trump's brand of politics. Thomas had been outspoken in her support of MacArthur's approach to global leadership, and the two developed a working relationship. Together, they began to push for international initiatives focused on democratic renewal, global cooperation, and combating misinformation. For MacArthur, it was clear that the fight he had waged wasn't just against Trump, it was part of a larger battle for the future of the world. The values he championed were beginning to resonate in unexpected places, from the halls of the UN to the streets of Washington, D.C. His fight had become a global movement, a call for responsible, honest leadership in a world that had been shaken by the forces of populism. Back in Canada, MacArthur's focus remained on the domestic issues that had long been his priority. As he continued to navigate the political landscape, he remained deeply committed to addressing Canada's challenges, from climate change to social inequality. His international work had never overshadowed his commitment to the people of his own country, and he worked tirelessly to ensure that Canada's progress continued on all fronts. And as the years passed, it became clear that MacArthur's influence would outlast any single political clash. He had become a voice for the values that many had hoped the world would return to. Integrity, truth, and cooperation were no longer just political talking points, they were guiding principles that nations could rally around. In the end, the world had witnessed an ideological battle that had far-reaching consequences. MacArthur had stood up to the populist wave, not with anger or hatred, but with a call for truth and decency. The result was not just a victory for Canada, but a victory for democracy itself. The ideological shift was unmistakable. The world had been changed, and MacArthur's legacy would be one of leadership defined by moral clarity and courage. Years passed, and the ideological battle between MacArthur and Trump became a defining chapter in the history of global politics. MacArthur's impact stretched far beyond the speeches and press conferences. His vision of a world led by values of truth, integrity, and cooperation had left an indelible mark on the fabric of international relations. The global political landscape had undergone a profound transformation. The forces of populism that once seemed so dominant were now in retreat. Trump's influence had diminished significantly, and with it, the divisive rhetoric that had so shaped the previous decade. His political rallies, though still held, had become shadows of their former selves, attended by fewer and fewer people as his base began to fracture. In the U.S., Emma Thomas, the moderate senator who had formed a close partnership with MacArthur, had risen to become a key leader in the Senate. Together with MacArthur, she pushed for reforms aimed at restoring civility and truth to the political discourse. The two became champions of a new generation of politicians who prioritized collaboration and honesty over division and conspiracy. Meanwhile, MacArthur's leadership in Canada continued to be a guiding light for the nation. His policies on climate change, social justice, and global diplomacy had set Canada on a path of sustainable growth and progressive change. Under his guidance, Canada had become a model for the world, a country that embraced diversity, truth, and global responsibility. MacArthur had never sought power for its own sake, but in time, his influence grew. He became not only a political leader but a moral compass for many around the world. His commitment to truth, integrity, and standing up for the common good had made him a beloved figure, not just in Canada, but across the globe. As MacArthur's political career entered its twilight years, there were calls for him to take on a more global role, perhaps as the next UN Secretary-General, or to lead a major international body focused on combating disinformation and promoting democratic values. But MacArthur, ever the humble statesman, had other plans. His greatest desire was always to create a world where integrity and honesty were the driving forces behind leadership, not just one person, but many. On the final day of his tenure as foreign minister, MacArthur gave a speech that would go down in history as one of his defining moments. Standing before the Canadian Parliament, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. "I've spent my life in service to my country and to the world," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've always believed that leadership is not about power or prestige. It's about standing up for what is right, no matter the cost. It's about ensuring that future generations inherit a world that is better than the one we found. And it's about doing so with honesty, dignity, and respect." MacArthur's words resonated across the political spectrum. It was clear that, while his time in office had come to an end, his influence would continue to shape the world for years to come. He had set a new standard for leadership, one rooted in truth, compassion, and a relentless commitment to the greater good. As MacArthur retired from public life, he returned to a quieter life, spending time with family and friends, reflecting on the many battles fought and the victories won. But even in his retirement, his work was far from over. He continued to advise global leaders, speak at international forums, and write about the importance of truth in leadership. And so, the legacy of Leo MacArthur lived on, one of courage, integrity, and unwavering commitment to the values that make democracy worth defending. His stand against Trump had been the catalyst for a larger movement, a movement that called for a world where leaders led with honesty and compassion, where truth was valued above all else, and where the future was shaped by the collective will of the people, not the egos of a few. The battle had been long, but in the end, MacArthur had proven that, no matter how loud the forces of division and deceit may be, the power of truth and integrity would always prevail. As MacArthur quietly slipped into retirement, the world had undeniably changed. The ideological battle that had once dominated headlines was now a distant memory, but the reverberations of his leadership were still being felt across the globe. His stand against the populism of Trump and the call for a new era of truth and integrity had helped shape the next generation of leaders, both in Canada and beyond. Years after MacArthur's departure from public office, his impact was still evident in the policies and global initiatives that had flourished under his influence. The principles he championed were woven into the fabric of international cooperation. His legacy continued to be a touchstone for leaders who refused to succumb to the temptations of authoritarianism and disinformation. One of MacArthur's most enduring contributions was the creation of the Global Integrity Initiative, an international coalition of nations committed to promoting transparency, fighting corruption, and ensuring that political leaders upheld the values of truth and justice. The initiative, which MacArthur had helped establish before retiring, became a cornerstone of global diplomacy and a model for how nations could work together to build a fairer, more just world. The annual summit of the Global Integrity Initiative became a place where leaders from all walks of life gathered not only to discuss global challenges but also to reaffirm their commitment to the values MacArthur had fought for. It became a space for collaboration, not just political posturing, and its success was a testament to the vision MacArthur had brought to life. In Canada, MacArthur's influence had laid the groundwork for a more ethical and inclusive political system. While not without its challenges, the country had continued to grow stronger, more compassionate, and more committed to upholding human rights and environmental stewardship. Under MacArthur's tenure, Canada had set a precedent for what it meant to lead with both strength and heart, and future leaders continued to carry that torch. MacArthur's private life, away from the political spotlight, had become a quiet one. He spent his days writing, mentoring young leaders, and quietly reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this place. He had remained, even in retirement, a voice of reason in a world that was still finding its way after the chaos of the past. On the day of his passing, the world mourned the loss of a leader whose commitment to truth, integrity, and global unity had changed the course of history. Tributes poured in from all corners of the world, leaders, activists, and everyday people who had been inspired by his unwavering dedication to building a better future for all. In his obituary, a simple yet profound statement summed up his life: a man who led not for glory, but for the greater good. At his memorial service, attended by dignitaries and citizens alike, the words of MacArthur's final speech as foreign minister were read aloud once more: leadership is not about power or prestige. It's about standing up for what is right, no matter the cost. It's about ensuring that future generations inherit a world that is better than the one we found. And it's about doing so with honesty, dignity, and respect. Those words, though spoken years before, had now become his epitaph, a reflection of a man who had not just witnessed history, but had shaped it. As the world moved forward, the ideals MacArthur had championed lived on. His call for truth, integrity, and cooperation had not only outlasted the battle with Trump but had inspired an entire generation of leaders and citizens to push for a world where democracy and decency were not just ideals, but lived. And so, Leo MacArthur's legacy was secure, not as a politician, but as a visionary who believed in the power of truth, the strength of unity, and the enduring belief that a better world was always possible.